Hi there, you're listening to Unnatural Selection, the show about newsy type stuff and things. My name is George.
My name is Adam.
And we are 2/3 of the Triforce that is Unnatural Selection. Make sure you visit us at our salubrious home on the web, unnaturalshow.com. How are we today, Adam?
I'm good. Triforce or Trifle? I was thinking you were going to say Trifle, and I was like, I could actually go some Trifle.
I could go Trifle
right now.
And no, I was thinking Triforce, as in from the Legend of Zelda, the Ocarina of Time. The Triforce is the...
I see. Yep, there's a video game reference that is unique to one particular thread of our generation.
No, that's what the people want. Is really just thoroughly unrelatable content that no one except other, elder millennials will understand. That's a media strategy, Adam. That's what it's called. Broad appeal. Yeah.
It's about targeting your audience. And if you're listening to this, what we're targeting you with is news stories from the last sort of week and a half and our hot takes on them, because who needs more stuff in terms of two guys on the internet saying words?
Adam, I think it's fair to say that not enough white guys talking about the news on a podcast, as far as I'm concerned. It's a blue sky, sort of opportunity,
Yep. Yeah, there's definitely a small niche that we were here first, to be fair. So
it's our patch,
we're the OGs.
As far as I'm concerned. We've been here for 15 years. Can you believe that? We've been doing this since before people knew what podcasts were. When I told people in the 2010s that I was doing a podcast, I had to explain what a podcast was to them.
What is a cast of podding?
Yes.
Is there pudding involved? I'm just really hungry.
It's radio, but it's on the internet. Yeah, we haven't had lunch. It's really and now when you tell people you're doing a podcast, like, oh, you're another idiot on the internet. I was the first idiot. We were the first idiots.
Originals.
We were the original idiots.
On grey since we started this podcast.
So have I.
Your hair looks jet black still. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about.
I wasn't talking about the hairs on my head. This is a show about news and politics. And today we are talking about the Productivity Roundtable. We have joined the rest of the Australian media, and we are going to engage in breathless reporting about the Productivity Roundtable for 6 consecutive days. So I hope you're ready, Adam. Strap in.
Oh, I'm ready. What is it like? I'm thinking like Knights of the Round Table. It's like Camelot.
Yep.
You've got, Jim Chalmers there. He's probably King Arthur in this instance. And then who's Lancelot?
I'd say surely Albanese's King Arthur and Jim Chalmers is the more charming Lancelot, surely.
Right. Okay. Yeah. The broad sex appeal.
The sex appeal of the upper echelons of the Labor government cannot be overstated. I mean, there's just an absolute room full of winners here. So in case you're wondering, the Productivity Roundtable is a very productive gathering of Australia's business and government policy union elite, where they sit around and discuss that they, announce pre-prepared policy statements in front of the cameras, and where we, the Australian populace, are meant to think, oh gosh, the government's really getting a handle on this productivity.
They're really discussing and
collaborating. Oh, just collaborating so fucking hard. Just stakeholders. Get all your stakeholders in there. Absolutely. And you can tell. So when I say breathless reporting, that I'm really not joking there. It's so funny when the Australian media decides to pay attention to something, how much juice they can squeeze from that particular orange. It's like, well, there's nothing going on this week. There was the embarrassing thing with Putin and Trump that we'll talk about later. The Trump administration hasn't bombed anyone. Yeah, they invaded DC and set up their own federal police force. But whatever. The Australians don't really care about that. What they care about, we've decided, the media this week, is productivity.
Productivity. And what does productivity mean?
Well, that's a great question, Adam. And I'm in the midst of drafting a 3-part Substack series, which no one will read.
No one asked for, and no one asked for, mind you, either.
Yeah. Well, you'll be pleased to know that the name of my Substack newsletter is Nobody Asked for This. So that is actually perfect. But it's productivity. So let's go back a step. There's there's been a lot of discussion about productivity in the public media space, and Jim Chalmers, the Treasurer, has been discussing this a lot recently, and it seems like it's a bit of a pet project of his. And the reason why is out of the OECD...
Michelle Bullock said so.
Well, Michelle Bullock and other highfalutin, overpaid people in the government and policy arena have been talking about productivity as kind of a problem in the Australian economy. And there are a number of reasons for that. So in the OECD, the sort of other major Western democratic countries that we sort of compare ourselves to, Australia isn't doing well in terms of productivity growth. We're sort of right in the middle of the pack. And this is a problem globally. This isn't just Australia, but you're seeing this in a lot of developed economies, is that how the government conceives of and forecasts in their budget is reliant on, metrics on a lot of things, but one of the key things is productivity growth. And essentially, you think about productivity, there's a couple of different ways of defining productivity, but just to sort of break it down to its most basic idea, it's how much output does each individual worker generate. So if you're a worker that works in a factory making widgets, this is always the business example, if you can churn out 200 widgets an hour as opposed to 100 widgets an hour, then you're being much more productive. You can sell those widgets into the economy, the boss can pay everyone more, and everyone's happy. And of course, that's not really how it works, and there's a couple of problems with productivity as a metric, which we'll talk about in a sec. But it is interesting that the way the news covered this, like there were like daily specials from the ABC being like, day one of the Productivity Commission, like we're going to sit down and fucking have David Spears here talking to the key stakeholders about what the Productivity Commission is going to recommend.
He's got to do something for that inflated salary of his. So
it's and so basically the idea is that the government's chairing this roundtable with all of these key stakeholders across the Australian economy and big business, and they're all going to have their input as to what the government can do, what their policy agenda can and should be in order to help improve productivity. Now, on the face of it, I mean, that sounds pretty good. I don't think it needs to be a rolling news coverage event like the fucking Olympics or anything, but that's fine.
It's the economic Olympics.
It's the nerd Olympics. Now, productivity as a measure, is really about, it's highly correlated with increasing GDP and growth and all that sort of stuff. But I think there's a lot of stuff that productivity metrics leave out. Like for one, they leave out like massive sectors of the economy, like about 25% of the Australian economy is just basically not measured in terms of productivity statistics. And some of those are like really key industries. But productivity as a metric tends to miss out on a couple of key things, which I think are important in discussions that don't really get mentioned. So you've got a bunch of heavyweights sitting around talking about productivity and we've got to increase productivity. And you can only imagine that the big business guys are going, we just need to cut corporate tax so we can be more productive. And it's like, okay, but like, for example, when the Trump administration 1.0 cut the corporate tax rate over in the USA in 2017, their big corporate Trump tax cuts, what you didn't see is massive gains in productivity. Like we have case studies on this where if you analyze the data and you do a massive corporate tax cut, where almost exclusively all of that money goes is into share buybacks, corporate profits, executive bonuses, all that sort of stuff. The problem with the economy that we have is not that large organizations, large corporations aren't able to extract enough profit. Like that's not the problem. We saw Commonwealth Bank declared a 10 point something billion dollar profit last year, as did all the other major banks recording, massive record profits. So, innovation is obviously important to growth and, disrupting industries brings about new things, new economies, and that's the way it's always worked historically. But there are certain sectors like manufacturing, which are ripe for increased productivity. As I said, the widget example, if you can make 200 widgets, well, then you're more productive, make more money.
So that's the easy example.
That's the easy example. The problem is...
like, if you're a consultant...
Yes.
If you're a service-based industry, which half of Australia is, we either dig stuff out of the ground or we provide services.
Yes. And that's the problem, is that a lot of these, they're saying, productivity growth's been low. We need it to be higher in order to, make a number go up for the budget and for the forecasts. But if you're a successful developed nation, you tend to move away from manufacturing and into, as you say, the service sector, where, professionals, consultants, and the example I use in this article yet to be released is nursing. So it's like, okay, well, these are industries that are growing. The growth industries like nursing and things like that are not industries where you can necessarily eke out additional productivity growth. If you're a nurse and you're looking after 10 patients, that's your output, is the care you are providing to those patients. If you want to make a nurse more productive, you go, okay, well, instead of 10 patients, you have 20 patients that you need to look after, right? We all agree that that's more productive, but it leaves out the quality. It's like the care that you are then providing to all of these people is then substantially worse. So it's really hard to get productivity growth in a service-based economy, which is what Australia and other Western developed nations are. So, we've had productivity growth from things like computers and technology. Those productivity gains tend to lag the introductions of those technologies pretty significantly. It wasn't until the internet and like consumer grade technologies came along and everyone became familiar with them that you actually started to see the gains from that. But that's really tapered off in recent years. And I think everyone's looking to AI and these other kinds of technologies to be the great white hope for the next generation of productivity gains. But those technologies are very much still in their infancy. Most people don't know how to use them. They haven't been integrated into people's like workflows at work. I think it's going to be several years before we start to see any of those gains start to flow through to the economy.
This is probably a good segue into what they actually discussed at the Economic Roundtable. So AI was a major topic of conversation.
Of course.
Barney Glover, who's the Commissioner of Jobs and Skills Australia, recently described AI as a foundational skill that needs to be taught in schools. The JSA, as a major report, found that clerical roles were among a number of white-collar occupations threatened by AI, but the technology was more likely to augment jobs rather than replace them. So this has been a discussion point in this economic roundtable as to what sort of comes out of that. I don't really know. I mean, what they're talking about is helping Australians skill up in the AI sector, or at least using AI tools, right?
Well, so in a bunch of different sectors. I mean, there's a bunch of different priority areas that the government has, like renewable energies, development, like AI, like cybersecurity, like, various trades and things like that. But obviously you want people to skill up, but if you want to do that, then you need to go out of your way to incentivize people skilling up so they have these skills that are important for the next generation of work. And if we have a government that is not willing to give people free like you are seeing some movement in this area, like the Victorian government has a free TAFE program for some of these priority areas where you can go to a TAFE and get a Cert 4 in cybersecurity or whatever and pay $0 out of pocket for particular courses and particular TAFEs. But it's not like, even if you take every graduate that's coming out of school now and put them into those priority areas, you're still not going to have enough skilled up people in order to fill the gaps that are coming up in the next 20, 30 years. So you either need to make university free more broadly, or TAFE and those sorts of services free more broadly, and also then encourage existing workers to come back and upskill. This is what universities call lifelong learning, the idea that you'll come back and reskill again throughout your life in order to upskill for these things. But like, someone's got to pay for that, right? So there's lots of recommendations. There's lots of people going, we need more skills, or unions are saying we want, businesses to pay for worker training, and the businesses are going, absolutely fucking not, thank you very much. Very difficult, unless there's a critical skill shortage, to get a business to pony up money for that sort of stuff, right? It's very difficult to get these kind of changes and upskilling and
Sally McManus,
someone's got to pay
hero
for it,
of the
right?
revolution.
I love Sally McManus.
She's the ACTU boss. She basically called that there would be a 1.5% levy on businesses with a turnover of 500,000 or above. Yeah. And I think most people, industry leaders in the at the economic roundtable were like, no.
Well, it's so funny because these businesses are the ones that are going to profit off of all this skilled labor. So it's like, I totally understand, if you guys want this, if we as a country need this, you guys need these workers, why not have some kind of like shared ownership of the responsibility of paying for it, right? But, obviously they don't want to pay a nickel more than they have to. Unions, obviously, the whole idea of unions is to create better conditions for workers and to, have them not working 80-hour weeks and no overtime pay and all that sort of stuff. It's like, well, that's kind of antithetical to the idea of getting more for less, which is what productivity is. And as I was sort of touching on before, productivity doesn't consider people's quality of life. It doesn't consider, for office jobs, for those sorts of things, how do you measure productivity gains? It's very mushy.
What is the output from,
what's the output?
Sending a few emails and discussing things around in a several meetings.
It's hard to define what the exact output is of like a white collar office job. That's why David Graeber, the author, calls them bullshit jobs, is because a lot of them don't necessarily contribute a defined discrete unit of output as valuable output. There's this what's it called, the sales. There's a sales podcast, I forget the name of it, the Inside Sales podcast, where the guy talks about doing dumb shit faster. And I think a lot of the technologies that have been introduced for modern office work, like Slack, and, they're meant to be, you can be so much more productive, you can collaborate with each other in real time.
Boom, 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 boom. Yeah.
But really what it does is it just creates an additional channel that you now need to manage and pay attention to and be distracted by, so you can't do your deep work or whatever it is you're working on because you're constantly getting pinged on Slack. And he calls, the inside sales guy calls it doing dumb shit faster. And it's like, well, that's not productivity, right? Doing dumb shit like sending memes to your colleagues, is not more productive than just like, sitting down and working on a piece of deep work for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So, and also doesn't account for, the happiness and the fulfillment of workers, like, getting people to do 10 things when they could do 5, doesn't necessarily, feeling constantly overworked and pressured to put out more and more and more, doesn't necessarily contribute to what people view as a good life and a healthy work-life balance. Like, these are the sort of things that unions have been fighting for.
So maybe we can be more productive, but at what cost?
But at what cost? Productive to whom? Productive to whose benefit? Who is the beneficiary of this additional productive capacity? That's never really sort of talked about. It's just like, we want to go from 10 to 12, from 12 to 15, number go up. But it's like, but what does that actually mean for workers? What does that actually mean for their quality of life? What does it mean for spending time with your kids or contributing to your community? Like, none of that is really captured in productivity metrics. And I find it so problematic that we're just talking about, we've got to be more. And it's like, well, isn't more like kind of what got us into this place in the first place? The idea that number go up forever, this kind of quarterly stakeholder capitalism, shareholder capitalism view of things, that just number has to go up every quarter in a linear 45-degree angle, is the problem. We're consuming the world's resources at a rate that is completely unprecedented. Yeah, if you make, whatever. Yeah, I follow a lot of retro gaming handheld stuff, right? So people who want to like, there's a new Android-based device and it can play all of your old PlayStation 2 games and Nintendo 64 games and all this sort of stuff. And there's various competing companies in China that do this sort of stuff. AYN, Retroid, these sorts of companies. Most people won't have heard of these companies, but they're constantly bringing out new handhelds. There's the Odin 2, there's the Odin 2 Portal, there's the Odin 2 Mini, there's the Retroid Pocket 5, there's, and they're constantly bringing out new stuff. Better OLED screens, faster processors, consumer electronic stuff. And that's great if you're in the space. But frankly, once you've got a device that satisfactorily allows you to play these games,
meets the requirements,
you don't then need a slightly better screen, a slightly better processor. And people online on Reddit will talk about, I've got an Odin 2 and I've got a Retroid and I've got this, but the new Odin Thor is coming out and that looks really good. I really want it. And it's like, okay, but isn't this just, yes, it's more productivity, it's more units of stuff being created, but we're just creating generations of unnecessary e-waste in order to create a little bit more GDP than we had the year before. And the planet can simply not sustain. If everyone consumed like America consumed.
That's the consumer problem with capitalism, right? We're a consumer economy and it relies, and our GDP is reliant on how much we consume.
Yeah, but is that good, is my point. Is like, yes, we're all buying more stuff. If everyone consumed like America consumed, the planet would be, our yearly allocation of resources would be, in terms of what we can sustainably consume, would be exhausted every year by April 17th, right? Americans consume 4 times more stuff than is healthy for the planet for them to consume. So if we make the entire global economy like that, we are headed straight for disaster. So yes, number go up and productivity is important, but at what cost?
You're saying,
right?
so your point being is, why are we even looking at productivity at all? Let's look at other metrics to
I think there's other things that we can include. I'm not saying productivity isn't important. Obviously, okay, so in the business literature, there's this thing called cost disease, right? Which is basically where there's an industry where it's very difficult to achieve product growth. So the example I like to use for this is a theater, right? A theater you need a stagehand, you need actors, you need costume people, you need makeup, there's just a certain amount of people that you need in order to put on a theater production, right? Unless you do 3 shows a day, you can't make that system more productive. And so what happens is, as the wages for each of these various people goes up, the only thing that a business can do to stay in business is to get more expensive. You see this in the university sector, you see it in early childhood, childcare and things like that. There's a reason that these services have gotten so expensive to the average consumer. It's because you can't make it more productive. You can only do 1 show a night. Yeah. You can only there's a ceiling in terms of how much more productive you can make those industries. And if you want to have theatre, if you want to have childcare, which I argue is a social good, it is necessary for the production of other GDP. For me to go to work, I need to leave my kid at childcare, right? It is necessary for the functioning of an economy, but can't necessarily get more productive. And in fact, the additional restrictions that governments place on these industries actually make them less productive in any ways. Now, you could say it's red tape. You could say it's regulations.
So what's the solution, though? Is it just that the government needs to subsidise those sectors then, that where there is a cap or a limit as to how... I mean, they kind of already do. They do subsidise aged care to a certain extent. The theatre sector has government grants, which it's relying on in certain, the major performing arts. A lot of the major performing arts organisations are relying on some sort of form of government subsidy.
I think that we as a society need to acknowledge that this neoliberal view of everything as a profit-driven endeavour is wholly insufficient when it comes to particular sectors of the economy. I'm not saying you can't view it through a pure productivity lens. I'm just saying you can't only view it through a productivity lens. It makes sense for there to be childcare. People need to be able to go to work. They need to be able to do things. In order to participate in the economy, that is a thing that needs to exist. And so measuring it on a productivity metric doesn't take into account the social good and the other elements that come from having this as a service for society. Healthcare, you want good quality healthcare. You want people to be able to go to a hospital and get the care that they need, and you want it to be good quality. And how fast they churn people through is irrelevant, right? That's what you want. You want quality.
Some sort of Triforce metric to understand it.
So look, I mean, there's scholarship on this. It's called the Kaplan and Norton, the famous business theorists back in the day, suggested a way of evaluating companies called the balanced scorecard. And that basically takes into account, yes, the profitability and growth and productivity, all that stuff is important. But in that assessment of a company, in that scorecard, you also need to consider the effect on society, the effect on natural resources, the effect on culture. All of these things, the way we exist as a society is downstream of how all of these various sectors of the economy choose to comport themselves, right? The society that we live in is comprised of large corporations and how they behave in the world. And if it's just a race to the bottom to make everything the most efficient.
If you read any annual report from any of these large corporations or even medium-sized corporations, they'll all talk about why their work's important and the social good, and they'll have schemes.
We need to measure it
to give back.
We need to measure it in a way that makes sense to the treasurer. Is my point.
The shareholders are just looking at I forgot the name of it. I'm doing a square thing.
A square, the box.
A square, a box. That's the financial report, but I can't remember exactly what the there's an actual name for the table
annual
that
report
I'm talking about.
You're talking about the financials in
Yeah, there's a name for the actual table.
Profit and loss.
I'm talking about profit and loss statement. Yes, there you go. Thank you. That's all the shareholders care about, right? And cash flow.
Yes, but I guess and I'm not saying that that's not important. Obviously, industries need to be profitable in order to justify themselves. But the point I'm making is like healthcare, like education, we want universities in Australia because universities provide a service that we all need and they are the pathway to upskilling. So you can't go, oh, how many fucking students can you crank out in an hour? That's not a useful way of looking at it, is my point, right? And
generally speaking, as someone who's been been through 2 university courses as well, the more students you have, generally, the less the
quality decreases.
Experiences.
Yeah. And productivity is related to, but it's not necessarily indicative of innovation. Productivity is a proxy for innovation. If you've got innovation and you've got disruptors and you've got people that are engaging in what the literature calls creative destruction, right? The idea that if you create an automobile, you're going to displace the horse and buggy industry. That creative destruction is generally considered to be good for an economy, but productivity and innovation are not necessarily the same thing. So you can use the example from the Soviet Union where, they displaced a lot of agrarian farm workers, which is historically not a very productive industry, and pushed them into the cities and pushed them into factories and said, now you're more productive factory workers. But the lives of those people were immiserated by having to live in inner city ghettos and having to do all that. And everyone looked at the Soviet Union like it was this economic miracle for decades up until the whole thing fell apart in the late 80s because they didn't have innovation. Innovation and productivity need to go together because if you're an innovator, if you're a black sheep in the Soviet system, you get your fucking head cut off. They don't want innovation. So it was kind of a trick. They were borrowing all the innovation from all these other countries and saying, oh, we can take all these farming technologies, we can take all this manufacturing expertise that's been developed elsewhere, we can use it, we can make our nation more productive. It looked for a decade or two like it was an economic juggernaut to the extent that America thought it was their greatest existential threat was the Soviet Union. But there comes a ceiling where if you're not innovating, if you're not creating new things, if you're just borrowing from other people, you hit a ceiling. And it's like, well, we're not going to get more productive. We're not going to grow more. You just kind of crash. And so it needs to be paired with an innovation agenda that actually makes sense. And you're going to piss off a lot of the people, a lot of the stakeholders at these productivity roundtables would be pissed off by the kinds of radical changes that would need to happen in order to actually increase innovation in the economy. So some examples I came up with was, rather than just cutting corporate tax across the board, targeting capital investment and tax relief for innovative industries that are going to disrupt established players. Creating a business environment where disruptors are preferred over rent seekers. Any organization that's just sitting there cashing checks, and has built up a moat around themselves to prevent competitors from breaking into the space, well, that's obviously not good for innovation and productivity. But the problem is these are the power brokers that are in the room that are protecting their own interests at the round table, right? A meaningful government-backed investment into supporting industries of the future, in supporting skills increases that we talked about before, but also startups in renewable energy, artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, information technology. These we know are going to be the industries of the future. So what government needs to do is support not just the training, not just reduce regulation and requirements of those kinds of companies to make it easy for people to enter the market, but they also need to they need to directly invest and make it more competitive for new entrants to get in than it is for existing entrants to keep existing. And that's going to piss off powerful people. And so given the incrementalism...
Woolworths and Coles will love that, George.
Yeah, exactly.
Be really happy with that.
What we've got is a stagnant duopoly in a lot of different areas of the Australian economy. You look at Bunnings. There's no other fucking hardware store that you can realistically go, like that's Mitre 10 that owns a fraction of a percentage of the market. Bunnings owns, I imagine, 60-70% of the market. That is not conducive to productivity and innovation, right? But Wesfarmers and Bunnings and, the big banks are the ones that are going to be invited to these productivity roundtables and give their recommendations. And what are their recommendations going to be? Cut red tape, cut corporate tax, right? It's not going to achieve what it need. Like, I'm all for an actual innovation agenda, but given the incrementalism of this government so far, I can't imagine that's what we're likely to get, right?
Oh, I mean, I think this is not the first one they've done either. I think there's been another sort of, roundtable or some sort of, either way, they do these sort of business forums every so often. So, and often the same sort of answers come out of them. So, is it all just for show? Will there be anything that Chalmers and Albanese were saying that some of the suggestions may end up in their half-year update at Christmas, and some of them will make it into the budget next year. But as to
we're not talking about a radical innovation agenda, right?
No,
we're talking about tweaks around the margins.
Albanese has said, though, that they're not going to do anything rapidly in the next 12 months, but that perhaps, if anything more, anything potentially a little bit more risque were to come on to be suggested, then that they would look at that potentially in the future. But, you're not going to see...
They're not innovating on innovation is what you're saying.
No. It's a token gesture to see if they can get any quick wins. And one of the quick wins was, to bring this back to what was actually discussed, was potentially, recognising skills from other parts of the world and different states.
It's called recognition of prior learning. Yeah.
Yeah. To see if, you can potentially have people, get out of their janitor job and actually go and work, in an industry they're qualified for.
The thing is, a lot of these regulations, a lot of this stuff has accreted over time because it protects certain constituencies, right? The fact that if you're an accountant and you need to go and get a chartered, be a member of the Chartered Accountants Association in order to be an accountant, well, that protects accountants. Like, that's a protection racket. If you say, Boris from Bratislava, who trained as an accountant, over there, can come over here and practice as an accountant, without any hurdles, that's probably more productive. We've got a higher skilled person working in the industry, et cetera. But the Chartered Accountants Association are not going to like that, right? So,
we're saying, fuck the man. The man needs to roll over and make some
I'm just saying, unless you're willing to piss a bunch of really powerful established industries off, you're not going to be able to achieve what it is they say that they want to achieve, right?
And this is probably a good segue to our next story, because I want to wrap this bow up in terms of established powers and protection rackets. There is an anti-corruption advocate, Transparency International Australia, that has called for greater scrutiny over political lobbyists in Australia. So they sort of ranked the various state governments as well as the federal government in terms of how transparent they were and how how many restrictions there were around sort of political lobbyists, and their interfacing with current members of Parliament and various other power brokers and members of government. And they found that the federal government is the worst out of all the governments in the country, including the states. Now, what we're talking about here specifically is former government or political members, so whether you're a member, shadow member, or whether you're a former minister, or maybe you worked for a minister, maybe you were high up, in the political advisor chain, those people then making leaving Parliament and walking promptly into a high-paid consulting six-figure salary.
Yeah, lobbying the exact people that you were just having lunch with as a colleague 2 days ago. Yeah,
and being able to sort of basically walk into Parliament House, without an escort, and just walk up to, get an appointment with, skip the queue, so to speak, get an appointment with, maybe the head of staff of the Minister for Transport, for instance, and make your case or your client's case to them directly.
Yeah, and the fact is the whole lobbying industry is predicated on this kind of access, right? This revolving door, is very much, necessitate, like, the whole reason the lobbying industry exists is because of this, right?
Yeah, and it's huge. There are apparently, at last count, around 727 lobbyists registered in the national capital, and that is more than 3 times the number of elected officials sitting in Parliament. So I think obviously to be a lobbyist, you do have to sort of register. You can't just be a random walking in. You have to sort of say, well, I'm here to
yes, but it also discounts all of the various peoples at the organizations that are putting those lobbyists in there that are also working around the clock to try and influence policy, think tanks, all that. Like there's a whole cottage industry that exists within the economy whose sole purpose is to concentrate resources at Canberra to achieve their outcomes, right?
And so the example that I think it was, Transparency International Australia were using was that, in terms of since 2001, almost every federal resource minister, bar one, has gone to work in the fossil fuel sector shortly after leaving Parliament.
Yeah, which is crazy.
As an example, for instance, say in Queensland, you've got to have a 3-year gap. So you've got to be out of Parliament for 3 years before you can potentially.
I thought it was 2 years, but there's some sort of exclusion period.
Yeah. So what they're saying is, at a minimum, you need to introduce some restrictions around that. But even
it is crazy that Scott Morrison put together the AUKUS plan and is now going and working with an AUKUS affiliated, defense contractor. Like that's crazy. Like that's such an obvious conflict of interest. And it's obviously not to the benefit of the Australian people to have highly influential people in power, party officials making decisions that they know will then feather their bed for once they exit politics. Like that's obvious, transparently not good for us, right?
Yeah. And whether or not, a 3-year gap actually, would make that much of a difference. I don't know.
I understand you need to give people the ability to make a living once they exit politics. But, if you're an ex-prime minister, you're on a pretty good fucking wicket regardless. You don't need to work if you don't want to, right? Yeah. You're getting a pension. You're getting a lot of good money. Like, you're fine. You get a lot of benefits outside of that as well. Like, there's a reason that ex-politicians get all these benefits. It's so they're not destitute and going around selling secrets, because they can't afford to live. They're making very healthy livings after politics already. It doesn't necessitate going and getting a 6-figure, job deal with the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, right? Like you're certainly not obliged to do that in order to earn a decent living.
No. And the other thing is that this, fundamentally it starts to upend the point of democracy, right? Which is that the representatives are in Parliament to listen to their constituents, and the constituents therefore inform policy and political decision making.
Seems like the only people that can't get into the building are the constituents. To make what we need is a poor
security.
We need to hire a poor people lobbyist. We'll all chip in $10 and we go, here's a lobbyist for poor people instead of BP or Shell or whoever. This is a everyday man lobbyist, and they can go and lobby Parliament on our behalf, because it seems like that's the only way that the average person is going to get their voice heard by people who are making decisions in Parliament, right? Is via a lobbyist.
Yeah. And you can see that, this sort of system has really caused issues in the United States, for example, where it is, a pay-to-play.
They call it the revolving door of Congress because people go out, they become lobbyists, and they come back in, and they go back out. It's what it shows to the extent to which specific pieces of legislation, there's been investigative reporting on this, shows that in states and in the federal government in the United States, I don't know if it happens here, specific pieces of legislation have been proven to be authored by the corporations that are lobbying the politicians. The politicians are so busy trying to fundraise that they go, okay, well, here's some money and here's a suggested piece of legislation that we've written for you that would benefit us. And they copy it and paste it into the fucking bill, which makes it through. Like, that is a crazy amount of influence and clearly not to the public interest, right?
No. So the question is, Australia, we're not in a great situation, but we're not as bad as perhaps some other larger economies. So maybe there's still a chance that we can correct this. Yeah. They tried to fix up the political donations thing last year or earlier this year. Will they potentially do the same with lobbying? Probably not, but
they're not. They're not incented to, right? The problem is with the stratified two-party political system that we have, is that both major political parties are incentivized to kind of keep the gravy train going. When you look at political donation tables, you go, okay, well, Labor are the good guys and the Liberals are the bad guys. It's like, actually not really. It's kind of a lot more complicated than that. You look at Woodside, you look at Santos, you look at all these major fossil fuel companies, almost all of them will donate to both sides of politics. So they get their bread buttered no matter who is in power, right? They put a bet each way. And both sides of politics are taking this kind of money and are entertaining these kind of lobbying efforts from that's why you see, this, the Albanese government still entertaining large fossil fuel projects from the likes of Santos and others. And they're saying, we're not going to stop approvals. You voted for us because we're meant to be the ones that are better on climate change. But actually, we're still going to approve all these fossil fuel projects anyway. And you go, well, why is that? And it's like, well, because both major parties are getting donations from these same stakeholders. So you will see some daylight on specific social policies. But with regards to fossil fuels, there's probably not as much daylight as you'd like to think for that reason, right? It breaks the purpose of representative politics, as far as I can tell, is this big money problem. And in some ways we're better than the US, and in some ways we're a lot worse. There was a great documentary by Craig Rucastle called is it A Big Deal or Great Deal or something like that, which talked about the lack of transparency in terms of donations in Australian politics and how bad it is in comparison to other similar countries.
That was before they did the.
I don't know how it's been affected by these those latest reforms, but to the extent to which, you could be waiting as the Australian public a full 18 months before you get disclosure on some of these, donations and lobbying efforts, and some of these donations aren't disclosed to the public at all. So I think there's still a lot of problems in terms of the representations that people are making to Parliament and the effect that it has on legislation. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. I mean, no one's running on a massive, radical transparency platform right now, right?
No, not at the federal level anyway. So, no, I won't get into that. I was going to say there's a whole thing around Friendly Geordies is currently targeting a lot of the independents, the Teals, because of this exact issue where they are...
Because they're Climate 200 backing and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, they're all backed by, various other... Yeah.
I mean, if you're going to be backed by someone, Climate 200 is probably not the worst organisation to be backed by as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
But
speaking of lobbyists, the... The war in Gaza and Israel's various activities in the area.
Activities is a generous way of describing it, yes.
And Australia's response to them have been informed to a certain extent by political lobbying. And that has started to shift over the last, month or so as, the situation in Gaza worsens. One of the things that there's a couple of stories we've got about Gaza here. So one of the things that's come up again is the question around Australian military export contracts to Israel during the period of this conflict.
Which the rhetoric has definitely changed a lot over the last 2 years with regards to that. Initially, it was straight up denials that the Australian government was supplying any kind of military aid to Israel. Richard Marles and Penny Wong would straight up get up in front of the Australian public and say, no, we're not supplying anything to them, sort of thing. And then as you see the statements change and evolve, as more and more information keeps coming out, the stuff we've talked about before with Bomber Bay doors and we're an F-16 country. Of course we supply parts and we don't know where the parts go, all that sort of stuff. It's a bit ridiculous now, right?
And so we don't know exactly what we're supplying. Basically, the information that we can get or that you're allowed to get from the government is that there have been certain permits issued. There are two classes of permits. There's a Part 1 permit, which is basically parts or things that would go into lethal munitions, weaponry, basically. Weaponry. There's also a Part 2, which could be used potentially for civilian dual use. So it could be civilian or it could be potentially
Bomber Bay doors, I don't think I would classify as civilian use.
So there are, at the moment, I think they're saying there are, I'll find the exact number here because there's several numbers in this article. there are currently 35 that are both Part 1 and Part 2 that are still because they've done a review basically of all these permits, and there are 35 of them they've said that they're in no further action. There are 16 permits that are being amended or lapsed, and 13 remain under review. So that 35 is a separate number. Now, of that 35, I believe I've got to work out here how many are still Part 1 or Part 2, but it's about half and half from memory when I read the article earlier this morning. Now, as to what they are, we don't know. So an example could be, maybe it's parts that go into making Kevlar body armor, right? So it's just a
the landing gear of a plane,
landing gear of a plane.
Those are the examples.
Maybe it's the widget that goes into
Speaking
a drone.
of widgets, how efficient, how productive are we at creating the death widgets?
The widget that goes into a drone, that could or could not be used, offensively, or if the drone,
Adam, it could be used to fly a pizza. It could be used to fly a pizza over into Gaza. You never know. You don't know what it's being used for.
But if here's an example. Like if the drone spots a target and then is used to then call in an artillery strike on that target, is the drone being used for military purposes? Right. So these are the kind of things where it's very grey. And
guns don't kill people. People kill people.
The government's now changed the rhetoric to say, well, we're not providing weapons, but we are providing, there are weapons exports, and some of them are dual use. We can't tell you what they are. And so, obviously, there are various members within the Australian Parliament as well as the community that are saying, well, what are these permits? Like, let us know.
I think we have a right to know. It's our government. That's our taxpayer dollars that's going into funding and R&D for these things. I think it's fair enough that we should know.
I mean, and there's, generally speaking, unfortunately, fortunately and unfortunately, there are security restrictions on all this stuff. So you've got to have like security clearance to work in any of these kind of projects, and there's national secrecy.
I understand that there's things that we can't know, but like specifically with regard to the Gaza conflict, I think we could have a lot more transparency than we do have. That's one of the failings of not just this Labor federal government, the Australian federal government in general, stretching back generations, has clamped down on whistleblower protections, has reduced transparency with regard to lobbying and donations and a bunch of other things. This is a problem in Australian politics in general. There was a great Irrational Fear episode all about this a year or so ago, where they were talking about the lack of transparency of the Australian government as compared to other similar countries. And it's bad. It's not good, right?
And this has happened amongst, I guess, the decision by Australia to now recognise the state of Palestine. And I think,
which Netanyahu was like, no worries, easy.
That's fine. Great. He's happy
enough.
about it.
I get it.
Very cool.
Very super chill about it.
No, it's basically now created a war of words. Has been the term that's being thrown around between Netanyahu and Albanese. I think Albanese was labelled weak by Netanyahu.
The quote was, a weak politician who betrayed Israel and abandoned Australia's Jews, which is a fucking wild thing to say about another country's leader from a diplomatic standpoint. It's also a wild fucking thing to say about an ally who's supported Israel throughout what can only be argued is human rights violations and crimes against humanity that they're perpetrating in Gaza at the moment. I think we've been a pretty reliable ally to Israel despite all of their actions. And the call, which I would argue, and most would argue, is pretty symbolic to recognize Palestine as a state, as France has done, as a number of other countries have said they're going to do in September at the UN General Assembly when that occurs. I think that's pretty disgusting and personal to say about another leader from Netanyahu's standpoint. And Anthony Albanese's response was pretty milquetoast, pretty passive. He said, well, look, I don't take these things personally and blah, 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 blah.
Well, Tony Burke was like...
Yeah, he called him a weak leader, and Tony Burke was like, well, I don't think it's weak to bomb children and starve people in Gaza. That doesn't make you a strong leader dropping bombs on defenseless children. That doesn't make you strong, bro. Which is fair enough. And there's been a commentary from the peak body of the Executive Council of Australian Jewry, is what it's called, has told both leaders in letters sent on Wednesday to address their two governments' policy differences, quote, through diplomacy rather than public posturing, and accused them of playing to their respective domestic constituencies. And it's like, yeah, there's only one party in this that's being like disrespectful and personal, and that's Netanyahu, right? Like, it's not like the Australian government has, critiqued Israel as vociferously as other nations like, South Africa or, Ireland or something like that. Like the Australian response has been pretty measured, and it's only now that we're, at a humanitarian crisis point in Gaza that it's joined many other countries in engaging in a pretty symbolic action to recognize Palestine as a state. Like, it's hardly a radical action from the Albanese government. And it's only after substantial pressure, right? Domestic and international, right?
I think I often, get very cynical about protests, and I say protests don't work and all this kind of stuff. But
I think seeing 300,000 people on the Sydney Harbour Bridge made the Labor government wake up, and it's changed the conversation. So it absolutely, it absolutely has an effect when it reaches a critical mass. Yeah,
I'll eat my humble pie on that one. So it's I don't know. I mean, this is the thing: is that Susan Ley, Liberal leader here in Australia, she's obviously taken the opposite view that, if the Liberals were elected, they would reverse all this back around, and that we shouldn't be...
Hey, please don't vote for us.
Yeah. We should be, but this is very disrespectful to Israel and all this kind of stuff. And, there's been a lot of reports coming out around Israel's lobbying and influence operations, not just in Australia, but overseas as well. And it's interesting to see sort of how they are able to shape the narrative of what they do on a global scale, and how that influences government decision-making within their supposed allies. So, yeah.
And we see that. It's a concerted campaign. There's nothing conspiratorial about it. It's a concerted campaign to influence the discussion, influence the media and how they're depicting the conflict in Gaza to Israel's benefit. So... the quote from Susan Ley is, "We are seeing a relationship that has deteriorated, and the consequences of that are not good." What an orator. "And they are spilling over into our relationship with the US, our most important ally." Quote, "The Prime Minister needs to explain how he is going to get this relationship that he has so badly mismanaged back on track." And this article from Pajama Politics that we put in the show notes talks about why do exactly we want to be back on track with Israel? A man who's got a Netanyahu who's got a finding against him from the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity and war crimes. There's an arrest warrant out for his arrest. Why exactly do we want to be super close with Israel again? Like, what exactly is the advantage to Australia?
What's the benefit?
What's the benefit to us again? Like, remind me. And it's not clear to me what the benefit of being back on track with Israel is, or why that's such a priority, given what they're doing and given what's happening. I think it's incumbent, but we have there's international law about this. Australia signed treaties that says we will not supply, weapons and material support to countries that are actively engaging in war crimes. So this arrangement that we allegedly have with Israel, where there's a two-way weapons trade, which they deny, or any other kind of, material trade that we have with them, is in direct violation of those treaty obligations. Right, we have obligations to abide by international law, and we're not doing that currently for the benefit of Israel, right? So and Netanyahu. So it just strikes me as a little bit. If it was any other country, if it was the Sudan, we would be so much more vociferous in our criticism than we are with Israel, and I think that's in part to do with some of these lobbying efforts. There was a piece that came out from Al Jazeera this week, which talked about, it was a BBC insider that basically said, we've been given explicit instructions that whenever the word genocide is used, or whenever there's any kind of critique of Israel on that kind of basis, we as the presenter are expected to push back on that language. And that's directly influenced by, Israel's pressure and peak bodies lobbying pressure on the BBC to prevent them from allowing those kinds of statements on air. That is a shocking violation of the public trust, to have the national broadcaster in the UK being effectively muzzled by a foreign body to advance their political interests Like that is a shocking revelation, really.
And that was the finding as well for the defamation suit with, and I've forgotten her
Antoinette
name.
Lattouf and
here in Australia, the judge actually sort of called it out in their findings that
that the ABC was happy to be lobbied by a pro-Israel group into firing Lattouf and silencing coverage on the national broadcaster. Like that is not acceptable in what is meant to be a transparent Western developed democracy, to have the national broadcaster being muzzled by what is essentially a foreign influence operation.
Yeah. And that's what I wonder, obviously there's cultural exports, there's like, for instance, in Melbourne, there's I think it's the Jewish Museum of Australia, which is all about Jewish culture. It's very interesting. I've been through it. I'd recommend people go and see it and check it out. There's those kind of organizations, but then I wonder, with these lobbyists, like how much of it is directly tied to, government policy within Israel to influence, as an official influence operation.
It's certainly serving their interests, right?
Yeah.
You can't say that Israel's interests are not being represented here in Australian media. And there's been analyses of this where they go, the kind of passive language that's used to describe the deaths of Palestinians versus the very active language that's used to describe the deaths of Israelis in this conflict. And it's chalk and cheese. The way it is described in the media is Palestinians spontaneously combust. They were bombed. Someone bombed them. We don't know who. Or they died. They weren't killed. They weren't murdered. They died spontaneously. And when Israelis die as part of the conflict, they were, brutally butchered by, And I'm not saying that we've got Jewish friends. I'm not saying that side of the discussion doesn't need to be represented, right? I am sympathetic to
100%.
Obviously, the anger and the frustration that they must feel, and the terror of what happened on October 7th. But it seems and not just seems, we're not
talking about October 7 now, though. Like, it's been over 2 years. What is October 7? There's still hostages. I completely understand that, but
I get it. I really do understand their perspective, and what I'm saying is that is very adequately represented in the media coverage.
Yeah.
And the other side of it, really is not.
But the narrative is shifting a bit now, I think, in the Australian media.
To some degree. But when you have, you see articles come out like, well, Israel says this XYZ is Hamas propaganda. And the lead quote and the pull quote and the first three major paragraphs are all about Israel's opinion. And you don't have any counterbalancing narrative from the other side to say, this is our perspective. This is you see this again and again in articles. People have run analyses on this. It's not just me saying, oh, the coverage is one-sided. They do sentiment analysis. They read the words. There are studies now that prove out that it is like an 85% bias towards the Israeli perspective with regards to many mainstream news outlets and how it's covered. Right? It's not just me making it up. This is proven out now. We've got enough data to look at now to know that the coverage has been very one-sided. And yes, it is starting to change. 2 years later, after 50, 60,000 people have been murdered, and that is after, and there was a report from The Economist a month or two ago which said, actually, we really think, given all these other data sources that we've compiled and laid over those statistics from the Hamas, whatever it's called, the Palestinian Health Authority. When you combine all of these other data sources and people that are missing and all that sort of stuff, we think the number's closer to 200,000 to 300,000 people have been killed, plus excess deaths, people that can't get cancer care, can't get, dialysis, can't get, when you overlay all of that on top of it, they think that 50 to 60,000 number is actually vastly underquoted compared to the actual destruction that's happened in the region. None of that stuff really gets the kind of attention that it would get if it was Israel on the other side of it, right? That's just a fact.
Yeah. Although I'd argue that in war, those kind of statistics always fall to one side anyway, due to the fog of war. So anyway, point being is lobbying sucks, and I'm happy that Australia is taking that step. But yeah, I mean, I also have the opinion that anything that we do is probably null and void. I think unless something drastically shifts domestically in Israel, they'll continue on their current course, and they've basically said they're going to take over the Gaza Strip. So here we are. Moving back to Australia now, very quickly. Time to wrap up the debacle that was the Tasmanian election in a neat little bow. And to do that, they had their first sitting day of Parliament, and the Labor leader, Dean Winter, said that he was going to call a no-confidence motion against the minority Liberal government. He did so and got no support from any of the crossbench or minor parties. So what that means is that the Liberal government are now their minority government is safe for the time being, and it also means that the Labor team officially, I guess, conceded the election, and they had a spill, which is part of their party rules after an election defeat. They spilled the leadership, and now they have a new leader, which is Josh Wiley, who's from the Labor left faction of the party in Tasmania. So he's the new opposition leader in Tasmania. Jeremy Rockcliffe remains the premier, albeit with a minority government, and I guess we'll see, on the floor whether or not the Liberals can actually pass any legislation. Time will tell. I suspect we'll be back at the polls sooner rather than later, would be my guess. But,
what's going on with the state of yours, buddy? What's happening there? It's a real shit show.
It's a 3-part miniseries, that's for sure.
Absolutely get a full season on iView several years from now. 100%.
We've still got the stadium issue. We've still got the whole salmon farming. So Jeremy Rockcliffe has made a few concessions to get supply, although not necessarily. But they haven't, the independents haven't necessarily guaranteed supply. But there's a few concessions they gave, such as doing a review
they're on board conceptually
and,
with the idea of supply.
Yeah. And some other bits and pieces, but whether or not they're going to try and ban greyhound racing, I think, in the state. So, a few things there which will keep them happy for the time being, but, whether or not it means they can get through any large, pieces of legislation where they can pass a budget, that kind of thing, I don't know. We'll see. So, yeah, that wraps that saga up in a bow for the time being. And there's not really any way to streamline it, but the next story we've got is, I guess, over in America. We haven't really touched on America too much.
It's been a thoroughly Australia-centric show. Our international listeners are just kicking themselves. We've discussed productivity for a full half hour, which wasn't very productive.
No, it wasn't productive at all.
But it made me feel better. So that's the important thing.
Yeah, that's why we do. The show is for our own catharsis.
It's a less expensive version of therapy, as far as I'm concerned. So
yeah, it's very cheap. The major thing in the US this week was that Trump and Putin had a summit to try and just sort out Ukraine.
Would we call it a summit, or would we call it, Donald Trump sitting in the cuck chair while Vladimir Putin sticks it to the EU? I don't know if I'd call it a summit per se.
They had a meeting which didn't go very well.
They met in Alaska.
They met,
which was a weird thing. There was lots of memes about the Russians saying how cool is it? They were sort of meeting in our former empire sort of thing. It's the whole thing. Yeah. It's just very weird and very much tipped towards Putin's benefit. I'm not generally one that sort of likes to overread the optics, but welcoming him with the red carpet on American territory, getting a bunch of big photo ops with him, shaking his hand, really kind of validates Vladimir Putin, kind of makes him look like he's not the international war criminal pariah that he is. And then, according to, from all accounts, the meeting itself was Putin came in, steamrolled, said what he wanted to say, and then that was it. Then they left. And then Putin goes and talks for 3 times as long as Trump does. He speaks first, gets his perspective out to the media, and then Trump is kind of says a couple of words and then he's out of there. It's they said, we've agreed to everything. They had this, where we've made a lot of progress. Trump then has a meeting with Zelensky and a bunch of the EU leaders later on in the week, and they've said, we've made a lot of progress, but nothing's materialized, no ceasefire. Trump said, I'll be disappointed if I don't get a ceasefire. That didn't happen. It just really feels like Putin came over and just absolutely cucked the shit out of Donald Trump, got his photo op, and fucked off back to Russia.
Same thing happened in his first term when he met with Kim Jong-un. Jong-un, sorry. Kim Jong-un.
I forgot about that.
Same thing happened. So he met with the dictator, said he'd sort out the whole thing, and then, since then, the North Koreans have been pumping out nukes like it's no tomorrow. So
it gave him a ride in the beast in the presidential car. Yeah. Like even fucking Macron doesn't get a ride in the beast. Like the whole thing is like very weird. The way he's just so happy to cuck himself to these fucking, and they're quite
dictatorial
happy to shitheads
to get the photo opportunity and then bend that photo opportunity into whatever sort of narrative they want.
That's all Putin wanted was a photo of him shaking his hand, and so they can deploy that for propaganda back home, right?
For months and months. And look, there was one small concession, I think, from Putin, which was that they acknowledged Ukraine would have to have certain security guarantees, but as to what that means, no one knows. Like
Trump was initially talking about having troops on the ground, and then it was like, oh no, we won't. I mean, no, and then it's
not those security guarantees.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, what is the security guarantee if it doesn't mean anything? Like the whole idea is that if there was to be a resolution to the conflict, that Ukraine can rest assured that they're not going to be reinvaded again 2 weeks from now when Russia feels like it. You've done badly when even Fox News is not giving a great appraisal of what the dear leader has been up to. Here's Jacqui Heinrich, senior White House correspondent for Fox News.
Just very unusual, atypical, and I think we're all awaiting, the readout, because the way that it felt in the room was not good. It did not seem like things went well, and it seemed like Putin came in and steamrolled, got right into what he wanted to say, and got his photo next to the president and then left. Of course, that is only the piece of the picture that we have right now, and certainly President Trump, who is the host and who is the president, would not want to, I think, enable something that would make him look weak.
He did. It's crazy when even, state media, that normally is cupping the balls of the dear leader was like, felt bad. I was in the room and it felt real bad.
I don't know. I mean, I guess Trump's trying to sort of, from his perspective, he's trying to fulfill that sort of promise of being the deal maker and everything.
He just wants his Nobel Prize. He just wants a fucking ceasefire. He doesn't give a shit who gets hurt or what it means for the future of Ukraine. He doesn't give a fuck about his European allies. Bro just wants a fucking prize.
And he wants to stop, sending, not just him, but I think, particularly like JD Vance and Pete Hegseth, they want to get out. They want to disengage to stop spending money on Ukraine.
But it does soften your negotiating position. I'm not a master negotiator, mind you. I did read Chris Voss's book, Never Split the Difference, but I'm not a master negotiator. It does seem like signaling that we want to get out of this real hard is probably not the strongest negotiating position to come from, because it's kind of suggests that Putin can do whatever the fuck he wants and they can get out of there, like they just want out. So the what he's putting forward is basically claiming most of the Donbass and like areas of territory that the Russians haven't even.
They want to secure the four, So they want the four major provinces that the Russians are in. So
but they don't currently control.
Luhansk.
Well, they're like saying we want more than what we didn't capture as part of the peace deal.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy.
They want to basically have those and then basically say, I think one of the things they said, they're like, we'll write a law that says that we can't take more territory, which is like, you've already
like the treaty that they signed back in the day that made Ukraine give up their nukes in exchange for an agreement that Russia wasn't going to invade, like that one.
For
that
security, some sort of security guarantee in the 90s. Anyway, the whole thing, massive shit show. But I think, this war will keep going until one country is basically their economy is crippled. That's kind of.
It doesn't seem to my mind that Russia has any interest whatsoever in disengaging from this conflict. Like clearly they're still going. like, I'm not an expert in this area, but it seems like they are still going for the maximalist position of we want it all and we want it now. And if you don't like it, you can get fucked. Like,
they haven't changed any of their positions on any sort of demands and what they believe.
Oh, and why would they? Because the longer this goes on, the better it goes for them, right? Like,
I did read watch a video about how while the transition to a war economy actually increased the productive output of the Russian economy,
got to get that GDP, got to get the widgets out.
It is. There are some early signs that is starting to create problems in certain sectors of the economy.
But the fact is, Russia, as a populace, as an economy, is just so much larger than Ukraine that on a long enough time scale, in a war of attrition, Ukraine will lose first.
Yeah,
right.
Particularly without Western support. If Western support drops off, then
exactly,
they won't last very long. But it is sad because I feel like there have been a few opportunities for the United States and Europe to potentially put extra pressure on the Russians, and that's failed.
Well, the way it's been described by analysts is that the US and other Western allies have given enough support to Ukraine for them to not lose the war, but never enough for them to actually win it. And it's hard to see how that does anything but prolong the conflict, right? So either you need to surge resources in there and say, take back some territory, draw some hard lines. Yeah, maybe the Ukrainians will have to make some concessions, but they're doing so from a place of strength.
Yeah.
I see that as... I don't think it's a fully apt comparison to compare Russia to compare Putin to Hitler. But it does strike me as a little bit like the Neville Chamberlain appeasement kind of process. It's like, if we just give him... if we just give him a bit of Austria, if we just give him a bit of Poland, like things will be all right. He'll calm down, and it's like I don't see that happening because
meanwhile,
for him it's existential, right? Like
you've got Finland and bloody Sweden and
shitting
Estonia
themselves.
and all those countries shitting themselves because they know that they're next.
They're like, hey NATO, can we hook up with you guys so we can get a security guarantee because not feeling super secure, and Trump and his administration will point to the fact that Europeans have surged their defense spending in response to all these threats, but it's only because of the insecurity that this very hollow security guarantee that the Americans are currently providing to NATO has caused, right? Like the Americans' flip-floppiness with regard to Ukraine has scared the shit out of the Europeans and created an existential crisis on their behalf. It's not like the Americans have been so good at getting the Europeans to take responsibility for their security by being great negotiators. They've been so weak on the world stage.
Hasn't been
that they've had to fill the void, right?
A positive reinforcement. It's been a negative one.
Yes.
Last two stories, very quickly.
So
the FBI's raided John Bolton's house.
Yeah. So John Bolton is Trump's former national security advisor in his first term. He went and wrote a book about his experience, as all good Trump senior national security advisors do. And the Trump administration, still in power at that time, was obviously slow walking the release of the book. When you're a high level security official or someone who works at the FBI or the CIA, your book has to go through security clearance to say, make sure you're not detailing anything that's sources and methods about how intelligence is gathered that might be secret or disadvantageous to the Americans, right? And obviously the Trump administration, not wanting John Bolton to profit off of this book out of personal animus, decided to slow walk this process. Now, so it was initially approved and then it went back under review. And then at that stage, John Bolton made the decision to release the book anyway. And by the time that the Biden administration came around, they dropped any sort of pending criminal charges that had come up as a result of this because they were just petty and personal. There was nothing in the book that was classified, right? And that's why presumably Bolton made the decision to release the book. He goes, I know there's nothing in here that's that's classified. They're just using that as a reason to delay the book. Anyway, so Trump's now back in charge, and we know that Trump's still got a grudge against John Bolton for all of this because, he pulled his security detail. It was like the first thing that he did when getting back into office in 2020. They opened an investigation. They withdrew his security clearance. They withdrew his protective detail, even though, there's been active threats from Iran against John Bolton as a former member of the high-level security apparatus. And now, presumably, before the statute of limitations is up, after 5 years, right on the dot, here the FBI is, raiding his house to try and presumably look for classified materials or come up with some other justification for prosecuting him. Who knows? But historically, it hasn't worked well when presidents have an enemies list, Nixon style, and start taking out, knifing members of their former administration. It's not generally a good sign of a healthy democracy. It's kind of the sort of
you mean American democracy is
Night of the Long Knives type of shit that the Nazis did. So
you mean that the Americans have got a democracy which might not be working properly? That's shocking to me.
I'm hearing some not good things. Yeah, apparently federalizing the police force and taking over an entire city in Washington DC, not a great sign of a healthy democracy. Not good
talking
stuff.
About. How good are hot dogs though? YouTube has a new AI age verification system, which has gone into effect in the United States. So it is a technology that will automatically add certain restrictions to your account if it thinks you're under 18 years old. So it's an age estimation model, which uses AI to establish if the user is under 18, and that is using factors like activity and the longevity of the account to estimate the age. So it's not necessarily taking photos of yourself and sending that in. It's looking more at sort of the metadata, I guess, that you generate from your account to make those decisions.
Judging by the videos that I watch, which are all about, economics explained and, productivity roundtables, I think it's going to assume that I'm safely in my 60s. So I think I should be fine.
Yep. And then obviously once your account is restricted, to unrestrict it, you then have to sort of prove your ID with a government ID or a selfie or a credit card or something like that. So,
I mean, it would surprise no one to know that Google and these other massive social media platforms have a trove of data about you. Knowing the age of the person using the account is probably like the least of the concerning pieces of information they have about you. But there's something about
if you
this.
go from watching bluey videos to being like, we're going to just start watching videos of people getting massacred in Ukraine, then perhaps something doesn't quite add up with that shift.
Well, I would say if you're watching bluey videos, you're probably the parent of a young child rather than just watching them directly yourself. It's probably more like the skibbity toilet video. Okay, if you're watching Andrew Tate, we can assume you're 14, right? Yeah.
Anyway, it'll be interesting to see how that affects Australia, because obviously there are restrictions that are meant to be coming into place in Australia.
Yeah, and the UK
over and above this.
The UK's obviously got similar restrictions that have come in for underage content and all this sort of stuff. We're not the only ones doing it here in Australia, but as we've highlighted on the show previously, I think the lack of transparency as to like how exactly these things are determined, how much data is being kept and collected and kept about all of this stuff, the lack of protections that it means young kids are going to have from advertising and more sort of restricted content, existing walls, like it all sort of remains to be seen, but it all feels just vaguely concerning and like a not that much better situation than what we had before. I don't know. I'm dubious about all of these age verification setups that are being proposed over the world. I just don't think it's going to do what they think it's going to do.
It's a blanket approach rather than really getting to any sort of specifics. I think you'll probably have a lot of people who are just having their accounts banned for no reason, which, you've seen things like this happen with Meta as well. Where,
they're already not good at this stuff, right?
They'll just block or ban an account. Yeah. Based on...
And you can go to customer service. You're not the customer, you're the product. The advertisers are the customer.
There is no customer service.
Yeah, they don't give a shit.
So, and that has been the last week and a half of the world that we deem as important to get into your ear holes. So we hope you've enjoyed the last... how long was this going for? Hour and a half now?
Hour and 18.
Hour and 18. I feel like it's gone for longer, but I think it's actually pretty good. I
feel like you always say that it feels long and you're not enjoying yourself and you're just having a bad time. It feels like longer than it is. But Adam, if we haven't shaken the 60 to 80 listeners that tune into the show every week at this point, we've got these people for life. We could start a cult. They're in. The people who are
the
in.
cult of.
The people who are in.
They're in like flu.
They're in deep.
Yeah. We're going to set up a commune in the Balinese jungle, and there'll be unfettered access to the internet, but only through a YouTube algorithm filter.
Yeah, only mediated through your and my voices. That's the healthy way to do it. On that note, we have been, we are, and we always will be Unnatural Selection. Make sure you visit us at our salubrious home on the web, unnaturalshow.com. Make sure you follow us on all the bullshit social medias that have, do, or ever will exist at our handle Unnatural Show. That's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Threads, and mother flippin' TikTok. Make sure you follow me on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at George Tsipos.
And you can follow me down to the Economic Roundtable, where I will be bringing a sword, because it's obviously a medieval reenactment.
Misunderstood what the round table's about.
It's a round table, so it's obviously like there's like chairs, and there's probably some chicken on the table, and everyone's got their armor, and we're all going to talk about the good of Camelot. Yeah. And that's. I
think if you unsheath a sword, you might get tackled by security. And my axe, and you just get spear tackled by someone.
You mean it's not like the Council of Elrond, whatever the fucking.
No, I don't think so.
Lord of the Rings. No. Okay.
Thanks for listening, guys. I love your faces. We'll see you next week.
I think more people should carry swords with them.
Don't say that.
For honor.
No,
for honor.
We're cutting that. Don't carry swords.
Okay.